London, December 1841. Ronald Martinez had spent 3 years perfecting the art of public cruelty, until the night the Duke of Ravensmere knelt before the woman Ronald had discarded, and every rule of English society shattered in a single impossible gesture. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tale stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The Ashworth-Carrington Christmas Eve ball commanded Belgrave Square like a gilded fortress of privilege. Candlelight poured from every window of the limestone mansion, casting amber fractals across fresh snow that had fallen since twilight. Inside, 300 of London's most distinguished families waltzed beneath crystal chandeliers, their jewels catching light with each turn, their laughter rising above strings and brass in practiced waves of festive performance. The air smelled of hothouse roses, champagne, and the particular perfume of wealth, beeswax candles, French cologne, and self-satisfaction. Sandra Rodriguez had 3 unbreakable rules for surviving these gatherings: arrive late enough to slip in unnoticed, position herself near exits or service corridors, and under absolutely no circumstances allow Ronald Martinez to see her vulnerable. On the evening of December 24th, 1841, she would fail spectacularly at all 3. She'd arrived under duress. Mrs. Alderton, the elderly widow who employed Sandra as a companion, had insisted with surprising steel in her voice, "You cannot spend another Christmas hidden away like some shameful secret. You've done nothing wrong. Hold your head high for precisely 2 hours, accept 1 cup of punch, and prove to yourself that you still exist in society." Sandra had managed 1 hour and 37 minutes when catastrophe found her. It began quietly enough. She stood near the Ada refreshment table, half concealed behind an elaborate arrangement of holly and ivy, watching couples spin past in burgundies and forest greens, in silks that cost more than she'd earned in 6 months. Her own gown, a modest creation of dove-grey muslin with careful mending at the sleeves, had been fashionable 3 seasons ago. Now it merely whispered what everyone already knew. Sandra Rodriguez lived at the margins of acceptable society, neither fully present nor entirely erased. She was reaching for a glass of water, not punch, never alcohol, when she needed all her composure, when she heard it. That laugh. Rich, confident, deliberately loud. The laugh that once had made her heart lift and now made her stomach clench with muscle memory of humiliation. Ronald Martinez stood 20 feet away, surrounded by 4 gentlemen in expensive tailoring, his own coat cut from fabric that caught the light like liquid onyx. He'd grown into his features over 3 years. Sharper jaw, broader, shoulders, the softness of youth replaced by something harder and more calculating. His hair gleamed with pomade. His cufflinks were gold. He was telling a story. She caught fragments, absolutely destitute. Couldn't even afford proper. Thought love was enough. Each phrase landed like a stone, and Sandra's fingers tightened on the water glass until her knuckles went white. Don't turn around. Don't let him see you watching. Don't let him know he still has power. But Ronald, as if sensing prey, turned his head. His gaze swept the room and locked directly onto hers. For one suspended moment, neither moved. Then his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, sharper than that, more triumphant. He began walking toward her. Sandra's breath shortened. The ballroom suddenly felt impossibly hot, the music too loud, the walls pressing inward. She calculated distances to doors, to corridors, to anywhere that wasn't here. But her body wouldn't obey the simple command to move. Ronald closed the gap with leisurely confidence, aware that others were watching now, following his trajectory toward the woman in the outdated gray gown. Two of his companions followed, smirking. Miss Rodriguez. His voice carried just far enough. What an unexpected pleasure. I'd wondered if you'd... He paused, as if searching for a polite word. Survive the winter. Sandra lifted her chin a fraction of an inch. Her voice came out steady, though it cost her everything. Mr. Martinez. Still taking charity positions, I assume? He glanced at her dress with theatrical concern. That gown looks familiar. Wasn't it fashionable during our acquaintance? One of his companions snickered. Sandra felt the attention of nearby guests turning toward them, conversations faltering as people recognized the shape of cruelty being performed in elegant language. This was what Ronald had perfected. Public humiliation dressed as concern, mockery wrapped in politeness. It serves its purpose, she said quietly. Admirable practicality. Ronald reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew several coins. He held them up where candlelight caught the silver. For coal, perhaps. The winter has been harsh, and I'd hate to think of you suffering from cold. No family to provide for you now, after all. The coins hung between them like an accusation. Sandra's throat closed. She couldn't take them. The gesture would complete her humiliation. She couldn't refuse them dramatically. That would suggest they mattered, that he mattered. The perfect trap. The music seemed very far away now. Ronald smiled, preparing to drop the coins into her hand, to force her into either acceptance or an undignified scene. His companions moved closer, eager witnesses to his dominance. And then, the crowd rippled. Conversations didn't just falter. They stopped. The collective intake of breath was audible even over the orchestra. Sandra felt it before. She saw it. A presence that changed the temperature of the room. Authority moving through space like pressure before a storm. Someone was approaching. Not walking, approaching with intent that made the crowd part instinctively. She turned her head. Lucas Blackwood, Duke of Ravensmere, crossed the ballroom floor as though the 300 guests, the decorated trees, the crystal and silken gold meant absolutely nothing. His evening clothes were perfectly tailored, black and white, severe and elegant. His face could have been carved from marble. Strong features, dark hair swept back, gray eyes that seemed to register everything and reveal nothing. He was looking directly at Sandra, not at Ronald. Not at the scene unfolding, at her. The Duke stopped 3 feet away. The coins in Ronald's hand suddenly looked pathetic, cheap. And then Lucas Blackwood did something that would be recounted in London drawing rooms for the next decade. He removed his white gloves. Slowly, deliberately, the soft leather whispered as he pulled each finger free. Then the Duke of Ravensmere, whose bloodline traced back 4 centuries, whose fortune could purchase half of Mayfair, whose word could make or destroy reputations, dropped smoothly to one knee before Sandra Rodriguez. The ballroom inhaled and forgot to breathe out. Ronald's coins clattered to the floor. Lucas extended one bare hand toward her, palm up, in a gesture of absolute, unmistakable respect. Miss Rodriguez, he said, and his voice carried in the sudden silence like a vow. Would you honor me with this dance? Not may I have this dance. Would you honor me? Sandra's vision blurred. Her hand trembled so violently she thought she might drop the water glass still clutched in her other hand. Every eye in the ballroom pressed against her skin like physical weight. The Duke remained kneeling, patient, unwavering. She could refuse. She could run. She could shatter into pieces right here on the polished floor. Or she could extend her hand. Sandra's fingers moved before her mind finished deciding. She set down the water glass with care, then placed her gloved hand in his bare palm. Lucas's fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, real. He rose with fluid grace, bringing her with him, and the room erupted. Not in whispers, in gasps, in exclamations barely restrained, in the sound of social order being rewritten in real time. Ronald stood frozen, coins scattered at his feet, his expression caught between rage and disbelief. The orchestra, after a moment's confusion, began a waltz. Lucas guided Sandra toward the center of the ballroom, and the crowd melted backward, creating space as though she'd always belonged there, as though the last 3 years of exclusion had been a collective hallucination. As they took position for the dance, Lucas leaned close enough that only she could hear. "You did not drop your glass," he said quietly. "That took more strength than, you know." Sandra's vision swam with tears she refused to release. I don't understand why. Because you are standing when you should have broken." His hand settled at her waist with perfect propriety. And because someone needed to acknowledge what was always true. The music swelled. Lucas guided her into the first turn, and Sandra Rodriguez, who'd had nothing but dignity for 3 years, danced at the center of the most important ballroom in London, while the Duke of Ravensmere held her as though she'd never been anything less than worthy. Behind them, forgotten and irrelevant, Ronald Martinez stared at the scattered coins. The distance between them measured more than feet. It measured the width between cruelty and respect, between mocking poverty and honoring worth, between the man who'd discarded her and the man who'd knelt. But the Duke's gesture, that single, impossible act of public humility, was not the beginning of Sandra's story. To understand what it meant for Lucas Blackwood to kneel, one must first understand what it cost Sandra Rodriguez to remain standing. Her story began not in a ballroom, but in another winter, 3 years earlier, when she'd believed in promises that didn't survive the death of her father and the revelation of debts she'd never known existed. 3 years earlier, Ronald Martinez had held Sandra's hands in the cramped parlor of her father's modest townhouse and sworn he would marry her even if they had to live on bread and hope. "I don't care about money," he'd said, his eyes bright with conviction that seemed so genuine she'd never thought to doubt it. "We'll build something together. You and me, Sandra. That's all that matters." They'd been poor together then. Ronald a clerk earning £30 annually. Sandra helping her father manage his failing import business. But poverty shared felt like adventure when you were 22 and believed love could substitute for security. They'd walked through cheaper markets, laughed over mended gloves, made plans and whispered conversations about a future where ambition and devotion would somehow alchemy into stability. Ronald had kissed her in the snow that December and promised, "No matter what comes, I'm yours." What came was her father's sudden death in February. What followed was the discovery that Ricardo Rodriguez hadn't been managing a failing business. He'd been desperately concealing catastrophic debts. Creditors descended like crows. The townhouse, the modest furnishings, her mother's jewelry. Everything disappeared into the maw of obligation within 6 weeks. Sandra found herself with £11, 3 dresses, and a surname that now whispered scandal rather than respectability. Ronald's first missed visit came with a note. Detained at work. Soon. The second cancellation arrived via messenger. Apologies. Unexpected commitment. By the 3rd week, the note stopped entirely. Sandra waited in boarding houses that smelled of boiled cabbage and resignation. She took work as a seamstress, then as a companion. She didn't write to Ronald. Pride prevented begging, and some part of her still believed he'd come. He did come, 4 months later. She'd seen him stepping from a private carriage on Bond Street, dressed in a coat that cost more than she'd earned since her father's death. New boots, gold watch chain, hair professionally barbered. Their eyes met across the street. Ronald's expression shifted through recognition, calculation, and something colder than indifference, embarrassment. He nodded once, curtly, then turned and walked into a shop that catered to gentlemen whose annual income began where hers ended. Sandra stood on the opposite pavement until her legs remembered how to move. She never spoke of it. Not to Mrs. Alderton, who employed her with uncommon kindness. Not to the few acquaintances who remembered her family. When Ronald's name surfaced in conversation, his promotion, his new connections, his presence at increasingly exclusive gatherings, Sandra simply changed subjects with practiced grace. Her loneliness wasn't abandonment, it was choice. She could have pursued Ronald, could have begged or manipulated, or played the victim. Instead, she endured. She worked. She remained silent, not from weakness, but because some dignities cannot be compromised, even when hunger and isolation press close. The invitation to the Ashworth-Carrington Christmas Eve. Ball arrived in November, forwarded by Mrs. Alderton's goddaughter. Sandra had held the cream-colored card, knowing Ronald would attend, knowing he'd see her poverty displayed against wealth she could no longer pretend to approach. She'd accepted anyway. Because dignity, she had learned, sometimes meant walking directly toward the thing that terrified you most. Lucas Blackwood had cultivated emotional restraint the way other men cultivated gardens, with deliberate attention and ruthless pruning of anything that threatened to grow wild. The Duke of Ravensmere operated by a single principle: observe, assess, but never interfere unnecessarily. Society's cruelties were not his to correct. He attended gatherings with detached civility, conducted business with precision, and maintained the kind of distance that kept both sentiment and chaos at bay. Then he noticed the woman in grey, who never asked for anything. He'd first seen Sandra Rodriguez at Lady Pemberton's autumn soirée. Not because she drew attention, quite the opposite. Lucas had observed how conversations seemed to gently die around her, how guests found reasons to drift toward other clusters, leaving her standing alone near the pianoforte with a teacup she never drank from. What caught his attention was her posture, straight-backed, composed, her face neither pleading for inclusion nor bitter at exclusion. She simply was, with a dignity that required no audience. Over subsequent weeks at smaller gatherings, Lucas found himself tracking her presence with increasing frequency. She listened far more than she spoke. When addressed, her responses were thoughtful, never desperate for approval. She never corrected the whispered distortions of her circumstances, the exaggerations of her father's debts, the implications that she'd somehow been complicit in financial ruin. Lady Hartwell, over tea, had described Sandra as that tragic Rodriguez girl, clinging to society despite having absolutely nothing. The assessment was delivered with performative sympathy that masked genuine contempt. Lucas had said nothing. His rule: don't interfere. But the rule fractured at Mrs. Caldwell's December tea. He'd watched from across the drawing room as Mr. Edmund Fairfax approached Sandra with what he clearly believed was magnanimous charity. Fairfax spoke loud enough for others to hear. "Miss Rodriguez, I understand you're seeking employment. My household requires a governess. Room and board provided naturally, and you'd only be expected to—" His pause was weighted. "Show appropriate gratitude for the opportunity." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sandra's expression never changed. She set down her saucer with careful precision. "Thank you, Mr. Fairfax, but I'm afraid my current position suits me very well." "Current position?" Fairfax's eyebrows rose in theatrical disbelief. "Surely you can't mean that companion arrangement with the widow Alderton. My dear girl, I'm offering you substantially more—" "No." The word was quiet, but absolute. "You're not." Sandra turned and walked toward the exit with measured steps, her spine straight despite the whispers erupting behind her. Lucas had watched her refuse humiliation disguised as rescue, watched her choose poverty with dignity over security laced with degradation. His respect shifted from observation to something uncomfortably close to admiration. That evening, alone in his study, Lucas stared at the invitation to the I.A.'s Ashworth-Carrington Christmas Eve Ball, an event he'd declined for 3 consecutive years. Excessive crowds, performative sentiment, exhausting social maneuvering. He'd heard Ronald Martinez would attend, heard Martinez had been spreading stories about his former connection to the destitute Rodriguez girl. Lucas picked up his pen and wrote his acceptance. Some rules, he realized, deserved to be broken. The Ashworth-Carrington ballroom glittered with calculated perfection. 1,000 candles burned in crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing through prisms into rainbow shards that danced across silk gowns and polished marble. The orchestra played Strauss with flawless precision. Hothouse flowers, roses, lilies, gardenias, erupted from massive arrangements, their perfume almost suffocating in its sweetness. Champagne flowed. Jewels caught light with each turn of the waltz. It was magnificent. It was merciless. Sandra entered alone, her grey muslin gown a whisper of inadequacy among the jewel-toned silks. Her hands trembled inside her mended gloves as she navigated the edges of the ballroom, seeking the refuge of walls and shadows. The anxiety pressed against her ribs like a physical weight. Every glance felt like assessment, every silence like judgment. She'd made it halfway to the refreshment table when she heard him. Ronald Martinez held court near the center of the room, surrounded by admirers drawn to success like moths to flame. His laughter rang out, rich, confident, designed to carry. He wore prosperity like armor, the expensive tailoring, the gold cufflinks, the easy posture of a man who'd left poverty behind and had no intention of looking back. He was telling stories. Charming stories. Stories that made his companions laugh and lean closer. Sandra recognized the cadence, recognized what came next. She tried to move deeper into the crowd, but movement drew his attention. Ronald's gaze locked onto her with predatory precision. His smile widened. He began walking toward her, two companions trailing behind like witnesses summoned to a performance. The conversations around Sandra faltered, then quieted. People sensed the shape of what was coming. Cruelty dressed in civility, violence committed with words instead of fists. Miss Rodriguez. Ronald's voice carried just far enough. What an unexpected pleasure. Sandra's throat constricted, but she managed a nod. Mr. Martinez. Still managing, I see. His gaze traveled over her dress with theatrical concern. Though the winter has been harsh, I'd wondered if you'd... He paused delicately. Persevered. One of his companions smirked. Sandra remained silent. Speech felt dangerous, like offering ammunition. No family to shelter you now, Ronald continued, his tone sympathetic in the way that made sympathy feel like accusation. No prospects. No protection from the cold. He reached into his waistcoat, extracting several silver coins. He held them up, where candlelight caught the metal. For coal, perhaps. I'd hate to think of you suffering. The coins hung between them like a verdict. Around them, conversations had stopped entirely. The orchestra played on, oblivious, but the guests closest to the scene watched with a fascinated horror of spectators at an execution. Sandra's vision narrowed. She couldn't take the coins. Acceptance would complete her humiliation. She couldn't refuse dramatically. That would suggest they mattered, that he still mattered. The perfect trap. Ronald's smile sharpened as he prepared to drop the coins into her hand, forcing her to either accept or cause a scene. Sandra stood frozen, her dignity the only thing she had left to lose. The coins began their descent toward her palm. The shift came like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Conversations didn't just pause, they stopped. The collective intake of breath was audible even over the orchestra's strings. 300 guests turned as one organism, sensing disruption in the social order. Lucas Blackwood crossed the ballroom floor with deliberate purpose. He moved through the crowd as though the glittering assembly, the decorated trees, the crystal and gold meant absolutely nothing. His evening clothes were severe elegance, black tailcoat, white waistcoat, not a thread out of place. His expression revealed nothing, but his grey eyes were fixed with absolute clarity. On Sandra. Not on Ronald Martinez. Not on the spectacle unfolding. On her. The Duke stopped 3 feet away. Ronald's outstretched hand, still holding the coins, froze mid-gesture. The silver suddenly looked cheap, tawdry, pathetic. Lucas said nothing. Instead, he reached up and began removing his white gloves with ceremonial slowness. The soft leather whispered as he pulled each finger free, the sound somehow audible in the crushing silence. Then Lucas Blackwood, Duke of Ravensmere, whose bloodline traced back 4 centuries, whose fortune could purchase half of Mayfair, whose word shaped reputations and futures, did something no one in that ballroom would ever forget. He dropped smoothly to one knee before Sandra Rodriguez. The ballroom forgot how to breathe. Ronald's coins clattered to the marble floor, scattering like broken promises. Lucas extended one bare hand toward Sandra, palm upward in a gesture of absolute, unmistakable respect. His voice carried in the silence like a vow spoken in a cathedral. "Miss Rodriguez, would you honor me with this dance? Not may I, not will you. Would you honor me?" Sandra's vision blurred. The room tilted. Her hand trembled so violently she thought she might shatter where she stood. Every eye in London's highest society pressed against her skin like physical weight, witnessing the impossible. The Duke remained kneeling, patient, unwavering, waiting for her answer as though nothing else in the world mattered. She could refuse. She could run. She could wake from whatever fever dream this was, or she could place her hand in his. Sandra's fingers moved before conscious thought completed. She extended her gloved hand and laid it carefully in his bare palm. Lucas's fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, real. He rose with fluid grace, bringing her with him, and the ballroom erupted. Not whispers, gasps, exclamations barely contained, the sound of 300 people watching social order rewrite itself in real time. Behind them, Ronald stood frozen, mouth half open, coins scattered at his feet like the ruins of his power. The orchestra, after a moment's confusion, began a waltz. Lucas guided Sandra toward the center of the floor. The crowd melted backward, creating space as though she'd always belonged there, as though the years of exclusion had been collective hallucination. As they took position, Lucas leaned close enough that only she could hear. "Breathe," he said quietly. "You've already done the hardest part. Don't understand. You remained standing when you should have broken." His hand settled at her waist with perfect propriety. That deserved acknowledgement. The music swelled. Lucas guided her into the first turn, and Sandra Rodriguez danced at the center of the most important ballroom in London, held by a duke who'd knelt as though she'd never been anything less than worthy. By Boxing Day, Sandra's modest lodgings had become an unlikely destination for London's finest stationery. Invitations arrived in cream envelopes with embossed seals. Lady Pemberton requested her presence at a New Year's soirée. The Countess of Westfield hoped she might attend an intimate dinner. Mrs. Hartwell, who'd called her that tragic Rodriguez girl mere weeks ago, wrote with effusive warmth about a January tea. The same women who'd allowed conversations to die round her now competed for her attention. Sandra sat at her small writing desk, staring at the pile of correspondence with something between disbelief and exhaustion. Mrs. Alderton, watching from the doorway, shook her head with knowing amusement. "They're not inviting you, dear," the widow said gently. "They're inviting the woman the Duke of Ravensmere knelt for. There's a difference." Sandra knew. The whispers had shifted from pitying to speculative. What does he see in her? There must be more to the story. Perhaps she's secretly well connected. How did we miss her quality? They were rewriting her history to match their new understanding, unable to accept that worth might exist independent of validation. Ronald Martinez, meanwhile, had become a ghost. At the few gatherings Sandra attended in the days following Christmas, he appeared and was systematically ignored. Conversations continued around him. Invitations were extended to others while he stood waiting. His stories met with polite nods rather than laughter. Society had made its calculation. The Duke's favor outweighed whatever minor entertainment Ronald provided. Sandra felt no triumph in his invisibility, only a hollow recognition that the same fickleness that destroyed her had now turned on him. On the 28th of December, Lucas called at Mrs. Alderton's townhouse with proper formality. They sat in the modest parlor, chaperoned, tea growing cold between them. "I need you to understand something," Lucas said, his grey eyes direct. "I have not rescued you." Sandra blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. "I will not offer you money, position, or protection unless you ask for them," he continued. "I will not assume your circumstances require fixing, or that my intervention has created obligation." He paused, measuring his words. "What happened at the ball was acknowledgement, Miss Rodriguez, not acquisition." Sandra's throat tightened. "Then why?" "Because someone needed to see you as you are." His voice softened fractionally. "Not as circumstance has made you appear." The distinction settled between them like a gift that required no repayment. "This is not a fairy tale," Sandra said quietly, understanding finally taking shape. "No," Lucas agreed. "It's a choice. Yours to make." He left shortly after, proper and respectful, leaving Sandra with invitations she hadn't sought and a freedom she'd never expected. Across town, Ronald Martinez stood at his window, watching carriages pass, recognizing none of them stopped for him anymore. His world hadn't shattered dramatically. It had simply stopped noticing he existed. Ronald found her on New Year's Eve, in the corridor outside Lady Pemberton's drawing room where Sandra had stepped away for air. He'd been waiting, she realized, watching for an opportunity when she'd be alone, unwitnessed, vulnerable to whatever he'd come to say. Sandra, not Miss Rodriguez. The familiarity was a weapon, an attempt to pull her back to when he'd had power over her heart. She turned slowly, her grey silk gown, a gift from Mrs. Alderton, rustling in the quiet corridor. "Mr. Martinez." His face was tight with something that might have been anger or fear, or both. The expensive coat couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders, the slight desperation in how he'd positioned himself between her and the drawing-room door. "You think you've won something," he said, voice low and bitter. "You think that spectacle at the Christmas ball changed anything?" Sandra said nothing. She'd learned silence was often the most devastating response. "He's using you." Ronald stepped closer. "The Duke. Whatever game he's playing, you're a pawn in it. Men like Ravensmere don't kneel for women like you without ulterior motives." "Women like me," Sandra repeated softly. "Poor, desperate, disgraced." Each word was meant to wound. "Do you honestly believe a Duke sees you as anything more than a charitable project? A momentary curiosity?" Something in Sandra's chest settled into perfect calm. She'd spent 3 years believing Ronald's departure proved her inadequacy. But standing here now, watching him scramble for weapons in his emptying arsenal, she saw the truth with crystalline clarity. He'd never left because she wasn't enough. He'd left because he wasn't. "I have always known my worth," Sandra said, her voice quiet but absolutely steady. "You simply never did." Ronald's expression cracked. "Your worth? You have nothing. No family, no fortune, no... And yet I'm still standing." She met his eyes without flinching. "While you're here, in a corridor, trying to convince me I should be ashamed of surviving what you were too weak to endure. I gave you everything. You gave me promises that required nothing of you." Sandra took one step forward, and Ronald instinctively stepped back. "The moment those promises became inconvenient, you disappeared. That wasn't strength, Ronald. That was cowardice." his face flushed with rage and humiliation. "You'll regret this. When the Duke loses interest, when society remembers what you really are." "I've always known what I really am," Sandra interrupted. "That was never the problem." She moved past him toward the drawing room, her shoulder nearly brushing his. Ronald grabbed her arm. "Sandra, wait." She looked down at his hand, then up at his face. Said nothing, simply waited. He released her as though burned. Sandra walked back into the light and music and conversation, leaving Ronald standing alone in the darkened corridor. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth seeing anymore. Lucas came to Mrs. Alderton's townhouse on the 2nd day of January, when the Christmas decorations had begun to look tired and the new year still felt uncertain. They walked in the small garden behind the house, frost crunching beneath their feet, their breath visible in the cold air. Mrs. Alderton watched from the window with the protective vigilance of a woman who'd seen too many promising conversations end in disappointment. "I have a proposition," Lucas said, his hands clasped behind his back. "Not what you might expect." Sandra's heart stumbled. She'd spent the past week trying not to imagine what might come next, trying not to hope for things that felt impossibly beyond her reach. "I would like your companionship," Lucas continued, his gray eyes steady. "Not your hand in marriage. Not yet. Perhaps not ever, if that's not what you want." Sandra stopped walking. "I don't understand." "I'm offering friendship, conversation, the opportunity to know each other without the weight of expectation or obligation." He turned to face her fully. "No financial arrangement, no promises that trap you, no rescue that becomes another form of cage." "Why?" The word came out barely above a whisper. "Because I suspect you've spent 3 years surviving," Lucas said quietly, "and very little time discovering who you are when you're not simply enduring." The truth of it struck her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on maintaining dignity, on not breaking, on proving she could withstand anything, she'd forgotten what it meant to actually live. "What if," Sandra's voice caught, "what if I become dependent? What if I start needing this, needing you, and then—" "Then you'll have learned something about yourself," Lucas said. "And so will I, but I won't disappear because things become difficult, Sandra. That's not who I am." She wanted to believe him, wanted it with an intensity that terrified her. "I need time," she said finally. "I know." Lucas's expression softened fractionally. "Take it. I'm not going anywhere." He left her standing in the frost-covered garden, neither promised nor abandoned, simply given space to choose. The days between the New Year and 12th night passed in strange suspension. Sandra attended gatherings where she was now welcomed. She wrote polite responses to invitations. She helped Mrs. Alderton with correspondence and needlework. And she thought about what she wanted, not just what she could survive, about connection versus dependence, about whether trusting someone again meant forgetting the lessons Ronald had taught her or finally applying them correctly. Lucas called 3 times that week. Each visit was brief, proper, asking nothing. He brought books he thought she might enjoy, discussed ideas rather than feelings. Left before she could feel pressed or obligated. He was, she realized, teaching her what respect looked like when it wasn't performative. On the morning of January 6th, Epiphany, the traditional end of Christmas, Sandra woke to find snow falling softly outside her window. The city looked clean and new, the darkness of winter temporarily transformed into something almost beautiful. She dressed carefully in the gray silk, pinned her hair with deliberate care, and made a decision. Not about forever, not about marriage or security or any of the things she'd once thought defined a future, but about today. About choosing connection over fear, about believing she deserved companionship that didn't require her to be anything other than herself. Sandra descended the stairs where Mrs. Alderton waited with knowing eyes and a carefully neutral expression. "I'm going to the chapel," Sandra said quietly. "I believe the Duke mentioned he attends morning service there." Mrs. Alderton smiled. "I thought you might." The chapel was small, ancient, and blessedly empty. Morning light filtered through stained glass, casting colored shadows across worn stone floors. The scent of beeswax and old wood lingered in the cold air. Sandra's footsteps echoed softly as she entered, her breath visible in the chill. Lucas stood near the altar, his back to the door. He wore simple dark clothing, no evidence of rank or title. Just a man in a quiet space, head slightly bowed as though listening to something only he could hear. He turned at the sound of her approach. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but recognition, as though he'd been waiting without knowing he was waiting. "Miss Rodriguez?" His voice was soft in the sacred space. "Sandra," she corrected gently. "I think we're past formality now." A hint of a smile touched his mouth. "Sandra, then." They stood in the colored light, neither moving closer nor retreating. The silence between them held weight, but no pressure. "I've been thinking," Sandra began, then stopped, searching for words that felt true. "About cages and freedom, about what it means to choose something because you want it, not because you need it." Lucas waited, giving her space to continue. "I want," her voice steadied, "I want to know you, not as the Duke who rescued me, because you didn't, not as salvation, because I don't need saving." She met his eyes. "Just as Lucas. As a person, I might actually—" She paused. "Care for." He crossed the distance between them in 3 measured steps. Then, to her complete astonishment, Lucas Blackwood dropped to one knee for the second time. But this time, there was no audience, no scandal, no performance. Just a man kneeling in a chapel, looking up at a woman with absolute clarity. "Not because you need me," Lucas said quietly, his voice rough with emotion barely contained. "Not because society demands it or circumstances require it." He extended his hand, palm up, mirroring that first impossible gesture. "But because I would be honored, truly honored, if you chose me." Sandra's vision blurred, but this time the tears were different. Not shock or disbelief, but something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Stand up," she whispered. "Sandra." "Stand up, Lucas." Firmer now. "I won't have you on your knees. Not for me. Not for anyone." She reached down and took both his hands, pulling him to his feet with more strength than her frame suggested. They stood face to face, eye level, equal. "If we do this," Sandra said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "we do it as partners, not Duke and poor relation, not rescuer and rescued. Just," she searched for the word, "just us." "Just us," Lucas agreed softly. "I don't want marriage," Sandra continued. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. I need to know who I am when I'm not just surviving. I need to learn what I want when fear isn't making all my decisions. Then we'll learn together." Lucas's hands tightened gently on hers. No expectations, no timeline, no obligations except honesty. Sandra nodded, something easing in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. "But I do want this," she said quietly. "Whatever this becomes, I want to choose it freely." "Then choose it," Lucas said. "Every day. And the day you stop choosing it, you tell me, and we adjust. No chains, Sandra. Not ever." She smiled, genuinely smiled, for the first time in 3 years. No chains. They stood together in the colored light as snow began falling outside, visible through the ancient windows. 2 people choosing connection without surrendering autonomy, choosing partnership without losing themselves. When they finally left the chapel, Sandra walked beside the Duke of Ravensmere. Not behind him. not ahead, beside. Her grey dress was still mended at the sleeves. Her circumstances had not magically transformed, but something fundamental had shifted, not in the world's perception of her worth, but in her own. She had always had value. She had simply chosen, finally, to believe it. And the man walking beside her, powerful, privileged, untouchable by society's standards, had knelt twice, not to elevate her, but to meet her where she stood. Because some things, Sandra understood now, were more important than status. Things like dignity, like choice, like love that didn't demand surrender as its price. Ronald Martinez had mocked her poverty and loneliness, expecting her to crumble. Instead, she had remained standing, and in the end, that had made all the difference. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.